So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alicia Simmons. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. On behalf of the Film and Media Studies program, I'm so pleased to welcome you here today for our second annual New Media Lecture. Today's talk is going to be Stereotypical News Exposure, Content and Effects in Traditional and Digital Contexts. I have to do a few thank yous, of course. Thank you to the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, to the SIO Chair of Diversity and Community, to the Division of University Studies, and to the Africana and Latin American Studies program for their support of this event. Thank you so very much. Now, in thinking about our community, we're bound together by the 13 goals of the Colgate education, as you all know. And so in thinking about today's lecture, I see it as touching on 3 of those particular aims. First, this talk explores media messages and stereotyping, and as such, it furthers our understanding of human behavior, social relations, and institutions. Second, this talk's appreciation for technological innovation helps us to see ourselves in both a global and historical context. And finally, this talk's attention to the evolution and persistence of stereotyping calls upon us to be engaged citizens striving for a just society. Today's speaker, Professor Travis Dixon, is the Communication Alumni Professorial Scholar and Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Illinois. Professor Dixon has dedicated his career to studying stereotyping in the media and the effects of this content on audience members. His noteworthy academic achievements include serving as the primary investigator for several externally funded projects, publication in prestigious journals such as the Journal of Communication and Communication Research, and an appointment as a visiting scholar at the Clinton School of Public Service. I look forward to learning from Professor Dixon's expertise, and I look forward to all of us joining in a vigorous question and answer session following his formal remarks. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dixon to our Colgate community.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here. Looking forward to speaking with you for a few minutes, and I hope that, there are all kinds of things that are in your CV, but maybe the outcome of the election doesn't hurt me that she said I was a Clinton Scholar. Don't endorse her or anything like that, but it was an honor to be there at that school. Okay, so this is one of the things I wanted to do today. I wanted to spend a little time kind of taking you on a little bit of a historical trip. So I know this is a new media lecture, and I promise I will talk about new media. However, in order to understand where we're going, what kinds of challenges we face, we do have to think about where we have been. And that's one of the things I'm going to kind of do as we proceed. Now, one of the things I want to do, this is a nice picture of me when I was younger. One of the things I want to do today is tell you a little bit about what I do, how I think about the projects that I engage in, and how I proceed, intellectually. I'm basically trying to do 2 things. The first thing I'm trying to do is document the nature of media representations of race, particularly looking at African Americans, but not exclusively, and you'll see that in my presentation today. So the first thing we need to understand, if we're going to understand media effects, from my vantage point, is to understand what kinds of things does the media tell us about race or stereotypes or groups. The second thing I try to understand is what effects do these particular kinds of representations have on viewers' conceptions of other people, okay? So I'm always proceeding with those kinds of things, and I'm always interested in theory, and I'm going to present at the end of our talk a little bit of a theoretical model that I've been thinking about, kicking around, developing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. Sometimes it's when you talk about social media, it's way cooler to talk to people who are under 25 years old. It's really cool. You can learn a lot more stuff. But I'm going to try to present that. The 2 main theories that I've been thinking about over the years involve cultivation. Cultivation basically says that the media tells us about a particular world, and the more we watch that world on television, the more we believe that the actual world outside of TV is like that TV world, okay? So essentially the idea of cultivation effects remain around the idea that television's world begins to influence our conception of the real world outside of TV. Social cognition and person perception is the second kind of theoretical perspective I take, where we look at a social group. You can take any particular social group. It can be police officers, it can be criminals, and then when you think about that particular group, what attributes come to mind that inform your understanding of that group. So those are the two big ones that I use. There's some other ones I'm going to talk about as well. I'm going to try to walk you through several studies that get you there. I know that there are some really, really smart students, some of which have had some background in quantitative statistical methods and know that stuff. And there are some people who, if you see a number, it will freak you out. And I will talk about these things in a way that hopefully you'll be able to get it, no matter if you're familiar with quants or not. Okay. When I began this journey, I began looking at local Los Angeles news programming, okay? And I was actually a graduate student at the time when I started thinking about some of these things. And there was a project at my school called the Violence Project. And the Violence Project looked at television coverage of violence in the entire, at that time it was like a big deal, because basically included both network television and cable, which was really cool, sexy. And so we were like really, like we thought that was a big deal. And then keep in mind, this is before the cool internet, 2.0 stuff, okay? So that was a big deal at that time. And the violence study was prohibited from actually looking at news. And so I began my work by thinking about news programming, and even though they didn't look at news, they actually recorded all the news programming for 3 years, and I used that to do a couple of studies. And one of the things that had been done in the past is how do we think about like whether or not the news is doing something that it shouldn't be doing with regards to racial representations. One of the ways that had been done in the past is something that I term intergroup measures, where we basically take a particular role, let's say we look at criminal suspects. And then we say, okay, let's compare the number of blacks versus whites who are criminal suspects. Okay, that may be one way to figure out if the news is misrepresenting race and crime, right? So one of the things we found by doing this is that for every white perpetrator on local television news, there were about 2 black perpetrators portrayed on television news, okay? The second way to do this is something called the inter-role comparison, where we just look at a single race and then we try to figure out whether or not they're showing up in more positive or negative kinds of representations. For instance, you might, back in the day, this was questionable back then, it's kind of more questionable now, but back a long time ago, if you were a perpetrator, that would be seen as a negative role, and if you were an officer, that would be seen as a positive role. I know that's controversial today, but back in those days, we thought of it that way, right? And so essentially, we wanted to see if you're looking at African Americans, do they tend to show up more as perps or more as officers? Same thing for whites, same thing for Latinos and other groups. And we found that blacks are twice as likely to appear as perpetrators rather than as officers, but that the opposite was true of whites. Now, a lot of studies that have been done kind of stopped there. They basically said, look at these ratios, this is totally out of whack, this shows that there's a problem. If I were to say that to you, and I was to stop there, what would be a problem with stopping there? Real question. Yes? What's the problem?
I think you have to look at the statistics of who actually commits crimes, because if black people do commit more crimes, they're going to be
shown as more criminal. Absolutely. Very good. Excellent answer. Okay? The first thing you should think about is, well, that's reality, right? Obviously, if you're committing more crime, you're going to show up in the news more as criminals. Or if you're more likely to be an officer in real life, you're going to show up more as an officer. Absolutely. Which is why we developed something called the inner reality measure, okay? So here, what we do is we take the representation that's in the media, and then we compare it to some sort of outside indicator of what's really going on, okay? And this is the one that we spent the most time doing, and I'm going to talk about in a couple of other studies here momentarily, okay? Well, what we found in the local television news really early study is that blacks were overrepresented as perpetrators. They were about 37% of the perpetrators on local TV news, but they're only 21% of the perpetrators according to crime reports. And that whites tend to be overrepresented in more positive roles. So for instance, there are about 69% of officers on TV news, but 59% in employment records. In terms of being victims, there are 43% of the victims we see on television news, but only 13% in crime reports. So they're way overrepresented as victims and as officers, and that we believe that causes a kind of distortion in your view of the world, right? So remember I said earlier, we document what do the effects look like, or what does the content look like, and then later from that we say, okay, what are the effects we can extrapolate? So one of the studies we did looked at, it was a survey, and what we tried to do here is find out whether or not people who ingested this kind of content on a regular basis, right? What kind of view of race and crime did they hold afterwards? And so we did like an old school, traditional survey. This is like pre-Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey for the professors out here who do this kind of stuff. So it cost us real money, $20,000 to do this one, which was real money at that time. And what we did was we had about 506 respondents, and they were real people. Although we do a lot of studies with students, we don't think you're real. You are real, not for the purposes of studies. So we did like, these are non-students who basically look like LA County in terms of their demographics, and we used a hierarchical regression model in this particular study using a lot of statistical controls. And we were wondering what happened, and what we found was that exposure to blacks' overrepresentation as criminals in local news basically led you to believe that blacks are violent, okay? Now, here's one of the things I want to say about the innovation of this study is we took the content. So we actually took the content and we knew what stations were bad and what were good, okay? So if you look at, for instance, Channel 5, which would be now on, Channel 5 is changing a lot. Is it still called the WB? Or not the WB? What is it now? CW? Yeah, it changes like every 2 years now, okay? What we now call the CW, right? All right, if you're watching that all the time and that's where you're getting your news, you're doing great because you're not seeing a lot of misrepresentation. However, if you're looking at NBC, you're getting lots and lots of black criminals who are doing horrible things. That's what you get into your house every day if you watch that particular content. And so if you're watching those kinds of shows on a regular basis, you come away with the stereotypical belief that blacks are violent. You're more likely to say that than if you're watching Channel 5, which is Channel 5 in LA, CW on a regular basis. Also, attention to crime news was related to higher estimates of concern about crime. This comes out of the cultivation literature, which says that the more you see this crime happening, the more you're actually concerned about it as an issue, you think it might impact you. So essentially what the news is telling you is that be afraid of crime, and particularly be afraid of black criminals. That's what's communicated, and that's what you begin to believe. Lastly, attention to crime news was associated, so when you watch the news, you can like really pay attention to the crime part, you can pay attention to sports, maybe you're really into sports, or maybe you're just watching it to figure out what to wear because I hear it gets cold around here sometimes, so, but it wasn't cold today, it was cold. Right? So if you're really paying attention to that crime news part, okay, if that's what you're really like looking at, then what ends up happening is, if I ask you about the incorrigibility, we actually did an experiment inside of here. So basically, I'm kind of summarizing an experiment in the survey. If I say, here's an example of a guy, and this is what he did, he's a juvenile, and he, robbed somebody, okay? Right? If I tell you that that juvenile is black, you're basically like, throw the book at him, he's incorrigible, he'll never change, he'll always commit crime. A similar thing happens if I say to you, I don't tell you the race. I basically don't tell you anything. I say I leave him unidentified. You'll basically say same thing. Throw the book at him. He deserves to go to jail for as long as possible. Never let him out. However, if I tell you that he's white, you're like, yeah, he's redeemable. Okay? But only if you're paying attention to this kind of crime news, right? That's when you see the effect. You pay attention to crime news, and he's white, you're like, not a big deal. But if he's black or unidentified, you like, throw the book at him. Now, who do you think the unidentified person is in the recipient's mind? What race is he?
Black.
He's black, right? He's a stand-in for black because you've seen so many black criminals, right, that over time, you just think crime is black. And so therefore, when I don't identify the criminal suspect, you're like, yeah, that's clearly a black kid, even though you didn't say that. And so therefore, yeah, throw the book at him, right? Okay. We moved on from that to thinking about network news programming. And network news programming isn't exactly like television news, and this becomes really important for the study I really want to spend more time on. It's different in that they talk more about policies and politics, okay? So for television news or local television news, they're trying to get ratings by getting you to watch because of whatever seems exciting in your neighborhood that is often crime, okay? Whereas the drama, like right now, they're trying to make a big deal out of who's going to win the nomination. Like it's really clear who's going to, by the way, you do know who's going to be the nominee, right? It's pretty clear who's going to be the nominee. Pretty much on both sides, but they're making you think it's so dramatic. We have no idea. You must watch next week to see who's going to win the nomination on the Democratic side or on the Republican. Oh, you gotta, it's like, and they're just, and the fact that there might be a contested convention on the Republican side, they're loving this. This is great stuff. This is how they get you to watch, okay? So politics and policies, making this horse race coverage is what they focus on. They don't focus on things like crime as much, and that becomes really useful to know because when you look at network news, again, network news. Okay, let me explain this really quick. Because I know, like, everybody over 30 knows what network news is, but some of you may not know what network news is. Some of you may not. Does somebody under 30 know what network news is? Can you explain to me what that is? I have hints up there, but can you tell me? What does that mean?
I don't know, but I think it's different from cable news.
It definitely is different from cable news, yes. How?
Cable news like you can usually tell what the agenda is.
Oh, you're talking about the political aspect of cable news. That is one part of how they market cable news, but that's not exactly what the difference is between them. Very, very close and very true, by the way, but not exactly the main difference. Yes, way in the back.
I'll try to take a quick stab.
Sure.
I'm not really sure. I
Okay.
think network news is more like broad national kinds of news, and
Okay.
it's probably run by really big corporations.
Okay.
So like CBS News, ABC, NBC News are network news.
Yes.
And then we have things like, I don't know what our local news is called, but
Right.
it basically just says like what's going on
In your
in
community.
your community, and it's probably more accurate than network news.
I'm not going to go with the accuracy part. We can all talk about problems with all of them. However, everything you said is basically true. And there's one little last part I'm going to add to what you just said, which is it's about the delivery system. So the delivery system is that there are a network, we say network meaning a group of television stations all across the United States that agree to air the same content at the same time. How many of you, man, it's always hard to do this now. It used to be so much easier 20 years ago, but fragmentation is crazy. But I'm going to guess here. Anybody? Grey's Anatomy? Raise your hand. Yes. Cool. It's hard out there. Any Scandal people?
Yes.
Scandal? Cool. When you watch Scandal or you watch Grey's Anatomy, you're watching the ABC network, and all these various ABC affiliates across the country have agreed to air Scandal at whatever time for them, okay? And similarly, there is a news program that each of them airs every night, okay? ABC, CBS, and NBC, right? So it's through that network of stations that you get the content. Historically, that particular information came over the air. Basically, it was literally analog, and it was sent through various things, satellite, microwave, at different points. I mean, basically, that's how it was delivered to you, basically, or to each other, and then they send it out to you. All right? That's historically what's happened. Just to let you know, I'll get to, since I'm going to talk about cable more momentarily, the main difference with cable is, why did cable start? Anybody know? I know. Broadcast, network, cable, and then we'll get to the digital stuff. But why do we have cable? I'm not ignoring you, I just don't want to miss the camera. So stand over here, sorry. Yes?
More TV channels?
Ooh, yes, more TV channels for who?
People.
That's exactly true.
People can afford it?
Well, yes. However, who did it originally serve? This community probably would be one of them, I would guess, initially. So historically, you needed cable in communities like this one, but you did not need cable if you lived in New York. Why not? Way in the back, sir.
They'd serve rural communities that weren't like
Yes.
near TV stations.
Very good. They serve rural communities that were not near TV stations. What they used to have back in the old days, this is when they first started, they basically had a head-in station. So they would basically go to the highest point in a mountain or something like that, and then they get signal, right, sent to them, and then they send that signal down via cable to the valley area, essentially, right, or to the remote area. That's how it was initially sent. Now it uses fiber optic cable and satellites and other kinds of things. That's how it was sent. That's how it was used initially. And then somebody got a great idea. They're like, hey, we can send out original content. We can actually have stations that we put out content, so we can have our own news stations like MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, MTV, HBO, right? We can do this, and we can actually like show movies or show other kinds of things, and that became a thing. And we'll get to that innovation momentarily. Okay, network news. What do we find there? Perpetrations accurately represented. Whites tend to actually be overrepresented in the more positive roles as victims and officers. That's very similar to local news. But the question for us with this new study is, that's a long time ago. The news media has changed quite a bit, more competitive, various things. Readership has gone down for newspapers, and network viewership has also gone down. And cable news is part of the reason why that's happening, and digital news is one of the reasons why that's happening. So has that had an impact on things? And there have been major news events that have also changed the way we receive news. One of the things that we have now that we have all the time that we didn't have before is the running ticker. It's always there, and that's because of 9/11. It started 9/11, it hasn't left since, okay? So how has that changed the landscape? So now we have cable and network, okay? I have to explain what those things are, so we got that, right? So thinking about all of that is what we recently did in 2015. Here's what we did. We included all of the major network news broadcasts, NBC, CBS, and ABC, and then we also looked at cable news, Fox Cable, CNN, and MSNBC. And then we, at the time I was at UCLA, and so there we had something called the Communication Archive. Communication Archive is something invented by one of my professors. He's a really brilliant guy. What he did was he actually started this back in the 70s, recording the Nixon Watergate hearings. And he recorded on whatever you could record on in the 70s. And kept just compiling news. And so several years ago, they digitized the entire archive, made it use a web search engine, and essentially we can get anything that's on both cable and local and network programming for LA. And so what we did was we did a search from 2008 to 2012 to develop 2 composite weeks of news programming. Trying to understand how the network and cable news represents crime and race here, and we ended up with about 140 of these programs. So here's what we were interested in this time. We looked at race again, just like we did before. And then we looked at law breaking, so we had traditional crime stuff like murder and that kind of thing, but we also added 2 new things that we didn't add before. We looked at terrorism, who commits terrorism, and who's identified as an undocumented immigrant or an immigrant in general. So we looked at immigration status. We also looked at people's religion, like were you identified as a Muslim or Christian or what have you. And then we looked at those crimes and activities that are tracked by U.S. government, think tanks, and independent scholars for that outside comparison, inter-reality comparison that we've done historically, okay? Oh, this is really fun, okay? Because I see a couple of you are going to sleep. So this is the fun part. Okay, this is what you get to do. This is my game. The game is called Name That Race. Okay, this is how it works. All right? I'm going to show you something. We're looking for the defendant. Who's the perpetrator, okay? And here's what I want to know. Let's say I'm going to give you 3 race or ethnicities slash ethnicities. Black, white, or Latino, okay? Black, white, or Latino. All right? Do those 3. All right? Now, I'm going to ask you after I show you the clip, for the defendant, for the criminal, or the suspect, is he or she black, white, or Latino? You ready? Okay, here we go. All right. He's going to be shown on the video, so tell me if you can see him.
Blames for the suicide of his son was sentenced today to 1 year in jail by a judge in Santa Monica. 40-year-old Harry Persigian was convicted last month of possession of cocaine and selling the drug to Hugh O'Connor. Walter Richards was in court for the sentencing and has this report.
Surrounded by family and friends, Harry Parisian leaves court after losing his battle to avoid a jail sentence. He also couldn't avoid the gang of news photographers. Now he prepares to spend a year behind bars. He was convicted last month of 2 felony drug counts for selling cocaine to actor Carol O'Connor's son Hugh. Hugh killed himself last year, apparently over his failed marriage and the prospect of undergoing more drug rehab. From the day his son died, O'Connor placed blame on Parisian.
I've taken responsibility for my drug violations, what I did wrong. Now it's time for other people to take responsibility for their family and their problems, because I had nothing to do with other situations except my own. Often Mr. O'Connor referred to you as Dirty Harry. What are your thoughts? No one ever called me that in my life.
O'Connor?
Okay. Raise your hand if you think this individual is black. Raise your hand if you think he's white. Okay, raise your hand if you think he's Latino. You guys are 100%. You guys can be coders on my project. Yes, he's a white guy. Awesome. Let's try another one. Oh, you know what? I want to do this one because this one's kind of distorted. All right. Anyway, we have to do that. That's what our coders do. Our coders get trained, and we try to figure out like race, crime, ethnicity, that kind of thing. Okay. So here's what's really interesting about this recent study. All right. So here you're gonna look. I'm gonna show you some numbers now. Don't freak out. I'll explain it to you. Okay. All right. So these are inter-reality comparisons, right? This time we're looking at the race of arrested violent perpetrators compared with the racial makeup of perpetrators on network and cable news. This column represents the arrest rate. So 39% of those arrested for violent crimes are African American, 59% are white, 2% are other, which is kind of a meaningless category here. But basically we included to make everything round to 100. All right, then TV. This is what happens on TV. 19% of those who commit violent crime on television news are black, 57% are white, 25% are other. What we do is we take this one and we subtract it from this one. If the number is a negative, that means that there's underrepresentation. If the number is positive, that means there's an overrepresentation. And what we found is that blacks were actually underrepresented as violent perpetrators on the news. If this number is bigger than this number, it means it's real for us. It's called statistical significance, okay? It's a technical term. All right, so here blacks are underrepresented as violent perpetrators on cable and network news. Others are overrepresented, but like I said, not really meaningful. We looked at the victims, found a similar thing for victims, right? Blacks are being underrepresented as the victims on television news, and others are overrepresented. By the way, whites are even. So this was like really new to us, something that we had not seen before. Keep in mind that part of the time of our analysis, there was certain controversies starting to arise regarding police behavior, Trayvon Martin, and other things, okay? And I'll come back to that in a minute, right? All right, so this is the race and crime replication, if you will, or attempt at replication, which didn't replicate. And it was new stuff. We then went on to ask about immigration status, okay? So here's what we did. We asked, okay, if the suspects, if we're looking at all the suspects in our sample, right, for which ones did you have their immigration status discussed, right? So your suspect, right, and your immigration status is revealed to us, right? How many of them are identified as immigrants? And we find that about 47% of the immigrants in the United States are Latino, but there are 97% of those who show up as suspects on television news, which is a big overrepresentation, all right? However, more useful to us, right, and in the political discussion of today, Trump victory, right, is the idea of being undocumented, okay? So what happens with that? Here's what happens with that. So about 75%, we think, it's hard to figure this one out. Okay, the other one, there's more official reports, but for this one's harder. We use the best data we had, right? And we guessed that about 75% of those who are undocumented in the United States are Latino, but pretty much it's almost everybody on TV is Latino, okay? So overrepresented. So basically, the idea that Latinos are immigrants who are undocumented and that's how we think of this problem and issue is something that is definitely strongly being represented in cable and network news. What about terrorism? This one might be a little surprising to you. So if we were to actually look at domestic, now, there's a difference between, just to be clear, there's international terrorism, which means it's terrorism that doesn't happen in the United States. Everything I'm talking about all day happens in the United States, okay? So we're talking about what happens on U.S. shores that in our country, okay? Not what happens in, like, Syria or something like that, okay? That's what this report is about, local or domestic. I hate the word domestic terrorism, I'll tell you in a minute why. But basically, things that we call domestic terrorism, that's what this report tells us, right? Who is a domestic terrorist? 6% of them are Muslim, 94% are not. But on television, 81% of those who are identified as being terrorists in the United States are Muslim, okay, which is a 75% representation. All right? Let me ask a question. Let me just go back here real quick. All right. Then I may skip over that other slide. So let me ask a question. So if this is the case, right, let's assume for now that I'm right. I am right, but that's okay. You know, let's assume right now that I'm right, okay? But why is that? Like why, okay, so who commits, so here's what's really interesting. Who commits terrorism in the United States? If we were, so our type of who commits it, our media type is that they are a Muslim person who like it wants to blow stuff up or shoot people or whatever, right? That's our view. You know, hate America, radical Islamic terrorist is what I think Cruz says we're supposed to call it, right? So, who is a terrorist in the United States? You have to go first. Go.
White men.
Okay, so white men who are what? Let's go through, let's see if we can type them, because I think we have them as like young, I think we have the Muslims as young, you know, men who are Muslim, I think. So what else do we say about these white men? Do we have a type for them? Yes.
Usually it's white men who come from rural areas, low income communities and things like that. So it's kind of framed as, oh, they did this because they don't know better, or something like that, as opposed to like, people who might identify as Muslim or be identified as Muslim. It's tied to their religion or how they like identify themselves.
Okay. Yes, what else?
Often white perpetrators of domestic terrorism are portrayed as like being associated with mental illness.
Mental illness. So yeah, so now you're talking about the media type. That's good. I want to talk about the real type. That's good. I like that. It's great. What else? Yes, way back.
Yeah, I would say white supremacists.
Thank you. That's the one we left out. Good.
Neo-Nazi groups.
Yes, thank you. White supremacists, militarist, separatist groups. Okay. So basically, there's one more that you probably won't guess. I'll just tell you. Usually ex-military. Okay. So usually white male, ex-military, white supremacist / separatist groups. Okay. Militia groups. Okay. That's normal. If we were to type the type of person who normally commits terrorism in the United States, that's the type. Okay. That would be the normal perpetrator. Okay. But yet that's not the case. So like Dylan here versus this guy right. All right. I know that there's some people in here who might get tests, so I'm trying to give you some. I'm giving the professor some things to test you on. All right. So here's some things. So why does this happen, right? Why does this happen? There's 3 explanations for why we think this happens, right? One of them is ethnic blame. Okay. So the way in which we talk about ethnic others is that we tend to blame ethnic others for problems that we face. Okay. So basically, if there is a problem with immigration, it's because of those Latinos. If there's a problem with terrorism, it's because of the Muslims, right? We basically tend to engage in that ethnocentric talk about ethnic others. This pervades the newsroom, right, the journalists, and then that gets out to us, and we think about it that way, we talk about it that way, and it's been kind of perpetuated. The other idea is something called structural limitations in economic interests. It basically goes to the idea of profits, right? And when I'm trying to make a profit, okay, to make a profit, you got to do 2 things. What are the 2 things you have to do to make a profit? I heard a lot of you are interested in finance, so somebody should be able to answer this question. 2 things to make a profit. Gotta do 2 things, basically. What?
Well, your revenue is greater than your expenses.
Yes, revenues have to be up and expenses have to be down, okay? So revenues in the context of the news means getting eyeballs, getting people to watch my show, okay? And so if you emphasize things, right, like terrorism and immigration, right, and make it really easy for people, that it gets more people watching you, other kinds of things that are harder, you don't cover those as much, that are more complex. People are just like, oh, that's way too complicated, they don't watch it, and so you're not covering those or covering those with the specificity, right? All right, the last idea is the guard dog, which is that the media covers threats to the power structure or the internal battles within the power structure. So crime has faded as a national issue over time. There are different kinds of internal battles that are happening right now. Definitely terrorism, definitely immigration are there, right? That's the current internal threat is immigration. The external threat is terrorism, right? And that's the reason why we think we see what we saw, okay? So this one, again, this is another one of those like summary ones. Black invisibility, crime issue has deteriorated. Now immigration is about this Latino threat, and terrorism is a problem with Muslims. We didn't do other things we could have done. By the way, we did have Fox News. People always wonder this. You mentioned this whole idea of partisanship with news, Fox News being a more conservative Republican channel. And when you look at just the breaking news programs, which is what we did, there really wasn't a difference between the Fox, CNN, or MSNBC here, okay? If you were to look at like Bill O'Reilly versus Rachel Maddow, you might see differences, but not the way we did it here. Okay, which gets us to social media. So, and internet news. So I'm going to talk about internet news and social media and report on a couple of studies. When we did some really early content analyses dealing with web news, basically CNN.com, as well as what we call non-traditional ones, that is standalone news sites that are blogs, basically, like Huffington Post and Drudge, right, which are like standalone. They don't have counterparts outside of the news, outside of the web. We found that, by and large, blacks weren't seen very much. When we did see them, they were really associated with poverty. We also found really strong associations between Muslims and terrorism, and Latino immigration. So those 3 things that came up with cable news came up when we looked at web news, by and large. But here's another really interesting thing, okay? If you watch a lot of online, or I should say search and or read a lot of online news, you tend to also report being a more prejudiced person, okay? So we found this really interesting association, controlling for lots of things. Again, I'm skipping through. I did good science, people, okay? For those who do science, social science stuff. I did good science, I'm just skipping down to the bottom. But we found that people, right, so there's 1 or 2 things that could be happening, obviously, right? What's the first thing? So I'm saying a correlation exists between online news consumption and prejudice. What's the first possibility for that correlation? Yes?
You can self-filter what kind of news you get access to.
Yes, so you can be looking at news and news websites that are clearly racist, prejudiced, whatever. There's like most of the ways that white supremacist groups stay alive now is online, okay? So you could be searching that out. What's the other possibility? Yes, way over there.
You can get extremely inaccurate results because the internet isn't the same as the news or whatever. You can lie so much easier on the internet than you can on television.
I'm not following you. The correlations between prejudice and so in other words, you say I'm a prejudice. People do sometimes think they're prejudiced, okay? Sounds weird in here in college, most of the time you try not to, but out in the real world they do. So people say, I'm prejudiced and I look at online news all the time, right? So why is that? She said one reason is that they're self-selecting, like internet news, that is racist. So clearly they're self-selecting things that are in alignment with their views. There's another way that could also be happening. Yes?
I was gonna say some views could be over Twitter, Facebook, and stuff, which is maybe just review that news that's on television.
So that less reviewed news tends to be more racist, and then it makes the person racist. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I guess, or just like, I don't know.
Well, let's try to answer the question. Okay, basically, there are two ways. We answered the first way. The second way is, what you're seeing online makes you more racist. Okay? Now, here's what's really interesting. I mean, these are not as well developed. These are pilot surveys. So there's two pilot surveys I want to share with you. Here's the first one. Okay? In the first one, we took a bunch of progressive people who see themselves as being non-prejudiced, okay? Who self-identify, right? And they're basically in a professional grad school. We basically had very, very small numbers here, so this is very preliminary stuff. But we still did like what we could do with regards to statistics to be as clean as we could, right? And we wanted to know, and this is again, we're asking about their social media use, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, right? We asked them how much they use those social networking sites, how much did they trust the news that they were encountering, and we then asked them for their support for conservative crime policy, things like 3 strikes legislation, things like that. And then remember that whole thing about perception of violence in blacks, we asked them about that again, okay? So here's what we found, right? So the more you trust the news, the more you have support for conservative crime policy, but also using social media was positively related to those stereotypical beliefs about African Americans. Now keep in mind, what's really interesting about this is that this is a very open-minded group of people, multiracial group that you would not expect these results from, okay? So that's the first thing I want to show you. Second one, did another pilot survey, okay? This one was bigger, right? A lot of statistical controls, 500 people. Basically, this is like a secondary analysis of the study I showed you earlier, but we're looking at a different measure, right? We actually looked at web news use here. And then we asked about potential suspects' incorrigibility, like, you know, inability to kind of become good, and concern about crime. So here's what we found. All right, so yeah, local TV news consumption is already related to concern about crime. I've already told you that earlier. But here's what happens when you're primarily looking at web news for your news. You also have a high concern about crime. All right. Also, similarly, if we're talking about incorrigibility, remember I talked about attention to news related to that. Guess what? If you are watching or using or consuming a lot of web news, you also come to believe in this incorrigibility. Okay? Basically those same relationships. Alright, so what do I think so far? Just really preliminarily, web news consumption is related to concern about crime and culpability assessments. It kind of mirrors the earlier findings. And social media use is directly tied to endorsing African American stereotypes. So, started wondering, how can this be? Do you have an idea? No, huh? It's intriguing. This is kind of where we are. We're really intrigued by this stuff. I'll explain to you where we're going with it in a minute, but we're intrigued. Let me tell you a story. It's an interesting story that kind of led me down this path of thinking about this. So, soon after the Trayvon Martin case, after George Zimmerman was acquitted, it was an interesting time. I was actually attending a predominantly African American church, and I remember going to church that day, and the pastor was talking about, you know, his child being really scared that somebody's going to come and shoot him, okay, because of the whole George Zimmerman thing. And during that time, I remember reading this social media post on Facebook. And a friend of mine, who I had attended another church with a long time ago, who happens to be white, he posted something really fascinating. What he said was, now that there's been an acquittal in the George Zimmerman case, the FBI is going to send some thugs down to Florida to cause rioting. That's exactly what he said. And here's the thing. So that thread continued, and the thread was like, yeah, that's so true. I know, and then various kinds of things that were basically racist were said on this thread. And I won't tell you about the personal interaction with my friend, but the bottom line is, I had no freaking idea what they were talking about. This is what threw me off. I mean, I was there and I was like, okay, I read 5 newspapers a day. I really try to stay up on things. What is the deal with this FBI crap, right? I mean, that's really where I was like, I just don't get it. So I was watching a program, and it was on a liberal station. It was Rachel Maddow, and I don't watch Rachel Maddow all the time, especially not then. And I just happened to be flipping stations, and she was on. I gotta leave it on for a minute. And she goes, "Some of you who have friends who are conservatives might have heard about this FBI rumor, and I'm going to explain it." And I was like, "Thank you, Rachel." I have no clue what you're talking about. It turns out that the FBI has a division. It has been around since the 60s, since the Civil Rights Movement. The division is designed to go into various communities and to prevent social, anarchy from occurring after various kinds of tension, racial tension that exists in that community. In other words, the job of the FBI group is to actually stop violence from occurring, not to incite violence. However, various conservative groups said that this organization is the opposite, or is at least going to function the opposite, because of course Barack Obama is the devil. And so basically that was the argument being put out there, and they were just all saying yeah, and they were all within. So we talk about the silos and the homophily and that kind of thing, but that's basically what was going on. And so part of this idea is that you can have self-selection, and that can result in this kind of stuff. So where I am now is trying to think about and tease out what may be happening here. So I am now proposing a new model, and it has, of course, has a sexy name, which I didn't put up here, which sounds funny. I call it the socially mediated stereotype model, and it basically, I know, right? Because everybody has to have a sexy name for this, right? So here's the idea, right? Historically, when we think about these effects, we basically thought about it from the cultivation standpoint. We also talk about priming and accessibility, right? That historically, you see something, it makes something accessible, like black criminal, and that's what you use in your judgments. Another theory that we've been using in this area is called social identity theory, and the idea of social identity theory is that I watch certain things or interact with certain people in certain ways to make myself feel better. So, if I want to feel better as a white person, I put down Latino people, for instance, and I think of them in derogatory ways so that I can feel better, as an example of that, right? So that's social identity theory. However, this is what you kind of do in the traditional media sense, but social media can be even more reinforcing. Agenda-setting is not dead, but there are all these different agendas that are being pushed by social groups, like Black Lives Matter or other kinds of groups that might try to push an agenda, as well as traditional media agendas, and now I'll talk about intermedia agenda-setting, so it gets complicated. There's also selective exposure, which can add to this reinforcement process. So perhaps we need to think about socially mediated stereotype reinforcement rooted in all these ideas. And so here's what I think is going on. First idea. There are dominant traits that proliferate on social media. They make racial stereotypes more accessible, but they are shaped by agenda setting and media diets. Okay? So that basically, in so many words, means that the amount or the extent to which cultivation has an impact on you depends upon your specific media diet and your specific set of agendas that may be reinforced, mutually reinforced by your choices and by the choices of your algorithm and your friends. Now, sometimes it's about how cool you can be, and that's social utility, right? How much do I want to be? One of the things happening in my friend's thread is certain people want to show that they're really cool. I'm going to show how hostile I am to Barack Obama and how much I hate people of color, and that's really important to me so that I can seem cool within this group and know this inside information that, the FBI, by the way, just so you know, I don't know if you all realize this, but one of the primary places in which there was no violence was in Sanford, Florida, where that group was deployed. So in other words, the group did exactly what it was supposed to do, and not what these people said it was allegedly going to do. All right. Just so you know. Just so you know factual stuff too. All right. So as a result of these two propositions, there are going to be three kinds of people in their interaction with social media. The first one is the unconscious bias group. Basically, this group is going to look a lot like traditional media consumers, which means that if it's a major idea that's being pushed out there, it may have stereotypical elements similar to what we found in the previous content analyses, and accessibility stuff is going to kick in and be more likely to be used. There's also the stereotype confirmers group. People who are in this group are going to perceive their identity as kind of being under assault, and that is largely the fault of outgroup members. So think people down here along the KKK lines, okay? And other white supremacist groups. Third group, though, is the anti-stereotype activist group. This group is going to see their role at utilizing digital media tools to break down stereotypes and try to push new agendas into the mainstream. Okay, so that's my idea. What I want to do now is stop and see if you have any questions for me. That's the end of the formal stuff, but I'll talk to you as long until they tell us we gotta leave. So what can I answer? Yes?
Is there any like echo chamber effect, you think? When you think about that, I think, the kind of the rumor mill.
That's the social utility stuff at
That's
work,
the social
right?
utility.
Yeah, because basically that echo chamber is being, I need to be cool within this group of friends, I've decided to this group of friends, I have to be impressive, and they tend to be conservative, they tend to be whatever, or whatever, right? And so I'm gonna put out these things that I think this group is gonna really like, and then it's self-reinforcing, self-selective, that kind of thing, if you're using it for that purpose.
I was thinking in terms of the progressives that are seeming to be more racist. So that if
you're still stuck on that first pilot study, huh?
Well, it's an interesting one. So I was thinking,
why did that happen?
If the universe of internet online news, right, the echo effect is that if there is a racist kind of storyline, that's the one that's going to be repeated a lot, so you're more likely to run across it.
Yes.
When you go online.
That's a bias group.
So the unbiased group of these progressives go online, and the general search
is
will
out
end
there.
up giving them the FBI is coming down, and they're gonna.
There you go. Or I'm not sure if it's that extreme, but I think it could be something along the lines of, let's go back to the Muslim finding. Like all the terrorists are Muslims, right? And why can't Barack Obama say that they're all Muslim? Right? They might be encountering that. That gets activated over and over and over again and makes the stereotype more accessible. I think that's what's going on with them. Yeah. But I do think it's three kind of groups that are operating in this space, and they don't always interact with one another. They're homophilous groups, largely, talking about this earlier, right? These are thoughts, but this last one especially is kind of what I think, and I'm more than willing to say, hey, maybe we think about it in modified ways as more data comes in. Right now we're involved in data collection on 3 studies to confirm that this model is true, and I'll let you know when I find out for sure, where we have to revise it, or what have you, but we're engaged in a kind of a large-scale content analysis experiment survey, looking at a group of users to see if we can find these groups defined in this way and using them in this way. We think we will, and we think we have, but I'm not ready. That data's not cooked yet, so I'm not ready to serve. Yeah.
Could you say more about what kind of questions you ask your respondents or how you ask them? Because I'm just wondering, there was something about targetability that you put up there. That respondents are actually saying the person of X ethnicity is beyond being, sort of returning.
How likely do you think the person's going to commit a crime in the next 10 years? How likely will this person be able to integrate well into society and become a productive member of society? How much do you think this person is likely to repeat their offense again? Those are kinds of incorrigible things. And people tend to say no when their defendant is black or unidentified. They tend to say yes when they're white, especially if they've watched a lot of news. And that's the key. So they watch a lot of news, and then if they're black and they watch a lot of news, They're like, oh, this guy's incorrigible. If they're white and watch a lot of the suspect is white and they watch a lot of news, they're like, oh no, he's redeemable. Yes?
I have two quick questions.
Sure.
One, how do you define what is news online? You're letting the respondent
Yes.
self-identify what news is, or do you specify certain things are news?
For the web news one, we actually asked them what sites they were,
Yeah.
and most of those sites were what we call, so to back up, we have looked at this more in detail, we had to breeze through it, try to get through everything. In the past, we have really made this big deal about what we call non-traditional, traditional plus, which is like defining like traditional media, our media that have these counterparts in the real world outside of social media or outside of the internet, like CNN, New York Times, LA Times, right? And then we've also looked at standalone non-traditional, which would be the blog sites or the other kinds of opinion news sites, like, you know, to give one on the left would be Huffington Post, to give one on the right would be Drudge Report, as an example of that, what that is. And so we've made a big deal out of it. In that study, the pilot study I showed you data, we let them define web news for whatever they wanted, and I can tell you that most of them defined it as traditional plus, that is, you know, those who had traditional counterparts like CNN.com, LATimes.com, what have you. So that's what it meant in that. That's what it primarily meant in that context. You know, and I know some people think that that's a big deal and that it matters, you know, which one it is. But in the context of that study, it was mostly those traditional counterparts. There were a few people who had blogs on there though too, but we put them all together.
Another quick question. What's the role of sort of individual entrepreneurs? And I think of Trump. I mean, he's clearly going out and advancing a particular agenda, taking advantage of this sort of existing raw material, but at the same time shaping a new reality. Is that, how important are those sort of figures to your model?
Very, because he's group number 3, right?
Yeah.
Or
He's
2,
more than
I
a
should
group.
say.
He's
but he's speaking. Those are his people, right? I mean, you know, he isn't just about the KKK or anything like that. Those are his people. So I mean, that's part of his job. He has a bigger mega. You're right. Now you're talking about intermedia agenda setting. So he has this bigger megaphone where he's able to talk about that. Mainstream news picks it up, and then social media picks it up, and then it feeds upon each other. So there is an intermedia agenda setting aspect that we are also kind of discussing here. What's interesting about this is it's not. So to sum this up, it's not like traditional media is wonderful, right? Right? So if you're getting that agenda from the traditional, because some people are like, oh no, it matters that you're getting it from LA Times or this, and it's like, no, they're not so wonderful. And then after that, social media allows you to select what is the most, or in the algorithms too, right? So it's, there's algorithms, source selection, what you click on, as well as the third thing of your groups, who's in your group, right? So those 3 things matter too in terms of what's coming into your feed. And so sometimes you'll have that intermedia agenda setting, and that this big force like Trump comes out and says it, gets covered by the traditional news, but then it gets put through your news feed. Different filters depending upon your algorithms, your particular media, like in terms of our set of friends, that kind of thing, and what you selected on in the past. So those things are mattering. If you're just casually using, like I talked to somebody earlier that said they don't use very much, you're going to still get those mainstream kind of stories that are going to be in alignment with those the stereotyping effects we talked about with traditional media, in my view. Unless you're selecting and being conscious of it and saying, I'm using this now as a platform for activism, to set new agendas, to make sure my friends set new agendas, kind of stuck. Tell me I'm wrong though, it's okay if you say you're not stuck. I think you're stuck. Your hand was up first, way in the back.
Yeah, so you mentioned, connecting to Peter's question, you mentioned intermedia agenda setting. So as college students, who I'm sure for the most part watch the news, and I'm also sure for the most part because we go to Colgate care about the world that we live in and being conscious of it. How do we get around all of that agenda setting and I guess in your personal life, how do you, I think you mentioned socially motivated news? Or what was the last
So
one?
here, you want to basically be in this last one.
Yeah, socially mediated.
So like basically, if you want to get around this, if you want to try to deal with this, this is my guess.
Yes.
Okay? This is my best guess right now. It's my best shot. You want to try to be part of this group. So
Okay.
you gotta move from unconscious to conscious. Because at the unconscious level, you're just like taking it in. Even if you look at cats, I mean, every once in a while there are things that come across your thread, ads, other things that are just like, whoa, and it's just reinforcing stereotypical thinking. So you have to try to move from that unconscious level to conscious, like, oh, that's totally not cool. I'm gonna go and find something on, I don't know, Black Lives Matter or, Latino Liberation Day or something like that. You know what I mean? Like whatever, you know what I mean, that might be countering to that. And then you're going to share it, engage in it more actively, and share that with your networks. And engage on it more actively. That's the, if I was to give a solution, that would be the best solution that I can offer you. I try to, and then, Facebook as an example, Twitter does something similar now too. They start getting fancy with the algorithm, and they notice you're doing that, you're doing more activist stuff and more counter-narrative, counter-stereotypical stuff. It's going to continue to send that to you, and so then that will be that helps set a new agenda for you where you're not getting as much of the stereotypical stuff. So that, the program will assist you over time as you do it. That would be my best guess of how you empower yourself.
Yeah, so follow-up question. With you mentioning cultivation hypothesis,
Yes.
How then would those algorithms and the way that we cultivate our individual life not connect to everyone else? Because then if I do group E, right, then on Facebook, in that sort of world, I'm cultivating my page and then cultivating friends' pages who also post those things. But then
if they choose to select and engage with you, yes.
Right, so I guess my question is, how then do you reach a broader audience outside of Facebook and outside of just things like that when we all have cultivation hypothesis?
Now you're talking about your job stuff. See, that's not my job, that's your job. You're asking me how to change. No, you're asking me how do you change the world, and I don't actually know the answer to that. I'm hoping to give you some good ideas so you can start working on that. I'll partner with you on changing the world, that's cool. I'm talking about the world in which we live. I'm not sure, because they're so homophilous. I mean, there are things that go viral that are good. There are things that go viral that are horrible, right? I was just talking to someone about this earlier over lunch, like, I don't know how to predict. If we can figure out, basically you're asking, how do we successfully predict how to make things go viral? If I knew that, I would probably not be talking to you. I'd probably be like a millionaire right now, because if I could successfully, I probably would. Actually, I love my job. Even if I was a millionaire, I'd still do this. But I'd be like, every day, like, okay, yeah, this is gonna go viral. Let me go ahead and charge YouTube all this ad, all these ad charges because I know it's gonna go viral. How do we predict that? It's incredibly hard, right? I mean, I don't know the answer to that. Or if I was a musician, we were talking about music earlier too. My sister's a musician. I'd totally get her stuff to go viral. Sure, why not? So I don't know. I don't have the answer for that. In other words, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I'm not trying to belittle your question either. It's a great question. I just don't know how you do that.
I guess I was more asking, how does cultivation hypothesis also happen with Group E? Or does it?
How does it happen? It still happens with them. I mean, it still happens with them. But if you are controlling more of what you're cultivating, then that reality does become your reality, right? You're taking control over it a little bit better. Yeah.
Yeah, so yesterday while checking the Democratic primary in the city, from New York City, so I was like, there's an infographic in the New York Times that had racial demographics and how they voted. And I was confused to click the white and it was like the whole city. I was very confused, and then they clicked black, and it was like only in Harlem and only in like East New York and Jamaica, Queens. And so my question is, how do we, or what do you think about kind of beating stereotypes when they are can be so deeply embedded in things like, embedded in society and things like where we live? You know, like if all white people live in the Upper East Side, or all black people live in Harlem, or all Latinos live in Washington Heights, like how do we defeat the stereotypes if they're all conjoined? You know, we're all living together, we're all, you understand what I'm saying?
I know totally what you're saying. Stop doing that. I mean, I know, I simplified it. Basically, you have to figure out a way to create dynamics with people who are not like you, as many as you can, whether or not it's virtual or in real life. And that's the first, it's called contact theory. There's an actual theory with like 40 years of research about it, on it. But basically, the more contact you have with lots of people who have different experiences from you, the more open your views are with regards to what those differences, can be and should be, and what becomes acceptable. So you can do that online too, and you can also do that in person. I'd much rather see in person, like what they say is there's a lot of contingencies on it though, like it's best that it's in person, it's best that it's non-competitive, it's best that it's, peer, things like that. But the more you have lots and lots, I don't want to say friends or others, that sounds so cliche, but literally associates, other people from all kinds of walks of life, it helps remind you that there are differences. And there are differences, here's the thing, there are lots of differences within groups, okay? We tend to exaggerate and suggest that there are lots of differences between groups. But the reality is there's tons of differences within groups. And the more friends, associates, whatever you have, that are not part of your group, and the more diversity you see, that's a plus. That helps break them down. It helps you, remind you to not be unconsciously biased against other people. It does. It's the best remedy that we've been able to think of over the last 40 years. So we can use social media perhaps to cultivate that idea more, although we tend to be homophilous in our groupings online. So maybe we fight that a little bit too and use social media for that purpose as well. Sure.
Yeah, I know that society is made up of individuals, so that would be probably the best mode of action, but my question was really like, what should society do? Or it seems that society needs to change before these kind of stereotypes can be debunked. If, like, certain things have led to, all black people living in Harlem. You know what I'm saying?
We're talking about structural problems right now.
Exactly.
Because I know I'm talking to a lot of sociology people. This is cool. And I agree. I agree that there should be structural differences. But I would also tell you that structural doesn't fix everything. There are all kinds of laws in place against anti-discrimination, against, we were talking about the misbehavior of police officers, to be on the books, and then they still do it, right? So like, I think that, and I'm not saying that you don't do it, I'm just saying it's that plus. So yeah, you have anti-discrimination laws, you have greater access to wealth for people who don't have it, you have like things that are mandatory or happen just as a matter of course in other countries, like healthcare, education access, like you can have those structural things, and then you still have to do some work too for the other stuff in a personal level, at a societal level. Like you have to make a choice, because we're in a democracy. Individuals have to make a choice if they're not going to be biased jerks, right? So that we make good decisions about policies and politicians who are going to represent those interests. So we have individual responsibilities as well as collective responsibilities. So that's my answer. My answer is that you're right, there's structural stuff, but the individual stuff plays a part in developing that structural stuff. I think we're out of time, right? So I'm going to stop here.
Yeah, thank you all so much.